Welcome, everyone. Boy, do we have the show for you today. Of course, I'm Michael Dismuke with Continuing Conversations. I am a freelance writer for Star Trek Adventures RPG and a blogger on Continuing Missions, which is the #1 site for Star Trek Adventures RPG in the universe. But we're really expanding our borders today. I can't wait to tell you who we have on, because we're going to really show the reach that Star Trek Adventures is going as we go into other realms. We already interviewed over the past couple of weeks. We know we had Thomas Marone with Star Trek Online and talked about the collaboration with Utopia Planitia. And today we're going to talk about another fantastic collaboration. So let me make some introductions to who we have on with us today. We have Jody Hauser. You may know her as a professional comic book writer. She works on many licensed properties. She's Eisner nominated. She's New York Times best-selling author and writer, and she works on fantastic titles like Stranger Things, Doctor Who. Wow. And of course, today we're going to talk about her work on Star Trek IDW. Jody, you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody.
All right, fantastic. We also have with us Jackson Lanzing. And of course, he was one of the main collaborators on forming the story for Star Trek for the Star Trek Year 5 with IDW Publishing. He's a creative professional with a wide-ranging skill set. By day, he's a creative director in brand marketing with an expertise in film and television. And by night, he too is a New York Times bestselling writer of comics, digital series, film, television, and animation. And of course, we know him from works like Captain America, Sentinel of Liberty, and Batman Beyond Neo Year. Boom. 2 mics dropped. Okay, so happy to have you with us here, Jackson.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be here. I always love it when my jump bio makes it into one of these things. Like, nobody cares about my day job. It's barely my day job anymore. But I'm glad when it gets brought up. It's very nice. It's really good to hang out with y'all. Huge fan of the game.
It was very hard for both Jody and for Jackson for me to truncate any kind of introduction for you. If you look up your names on YouTube, I mean, everything's everywhere. I think you own SDCC from what I saw from a lot of the videos. We're on all different channels.
Jody literally not literally owns SDCC, but she has like a long history with San Diego Comic-Con. I mean, there's a music video out there.
This year was I did do a music video one year. But I mean, this year was Jackson and his co-writer Colin Kelly's year for sure. So.
We had a big one this year. It was very fun.
Saw those for sure. Of course, we also have with us the wonderful Fred Love. Anybody who follows this podcast know we have worshipped his modules many times. He's a Star Trek Adventures freelance writer. I love his games, play them quite a bit as we're in season 5 of our own online Discord Star Trek Adventures game. Say hi, Fred.
Hey, everybody. So good to be here with this illustrious panel. And thanks for having me, Michael. Good to talk to you again.
Yeah, I had nerves for you, just figuring out how to take this amazing story of Star Trek Year 5 and try to truncate it into a gaming module, a supplement for us to use. I had nerves for you. So we're going to be breaking this all down today about that evolution of that process. And who better than to talk about how that process even started, but Jim Johnson. Go ahead and introduce yourself and lead us off on this, Jim.
Sure thing. Hey, everybody. I'm Jim Johnson. I'm the project manager and line editor for the Star Trek Adventures role-playing game published by Modiphius Entertainment. And I am super, super excited to be here tonight. I mean, who knew like a year ago, Michael, or almost a year ago now, that we'd be able to get some, I mean, just unbelievably fantastic guests. I'm so excited. I know it took a while to get this scheduling worked out, but boy, this is so cool. I mean, I'm just going to fanboy all over it for a second here and just say that like Year 5 was amazing. Like I finally got the last graphic novel collection, a couple of months ago and read it, and I had to read it over again. And my son, who's about to turn 7 tomorrow, he's seen it and he's flipped through it. He can't read yet, but he's flipping through it, and I think he's going to ask me to read it to him at some point. And I'm ready to jump into it with him because he just loved all the different art and the characters and I think it's the Ikosa. Is that the right pronunciation for?
Yes.
Awesome. Got it on the first try.
Yeah, got it in the first try. The Icosa. Well done. I'll since that's actually kind of a gaming pun, I'll maybe spill out why we called them the Icosa later.
Okay.
We love Easter eggs, so that's great.
Oh, yeah. I'm here for it.
Awesome. Cool.
First off, just again as a footnote, that's a lovely thing about comic books. What you just pointed out right there, like that's not a story that you can really say about novels generally, unless the cover is like super evocative. The barrier to entry for children into comics is so low because so much of the deal is a visual medium. We always have that like rule of like, or that test of, could you tell the whole story without reading any of the dialogue? Then it's a good comic. And like, I genuinely think like a lot of the accessibility of it is why we do comics. Like you can reach a huge audience who all find different stuff out of the story. So that actually really means a lot to me, Jim. That's awesome.
And with licensed comics like this, it's a way to tell a story that, you might not have the budget to tell in another format. You might not have the actors available to tell, but it's a way for people who maybe don't follow comics to sort of jump in and see like a contained story with characters they know. And it's a great way into the medium, which is why I've always loved working on licensed books. I've had so many people say, I bought my first comic and you wrote it. And it's kind of like no better feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know how the rest of you feel, but I kind of feel like comic books and role-playing games are kind of connected and similar in a way, because like in a role-playing game, you don't have a budget. You don't have to worry about a budget. You can imagine literally anything you want at the game table, whether it's virtual or real. Like if you want to have an amazing alien with, all kinds of different things going on, eyes, heads, ears, you don't have to worry about a prosthetics budget. You don't have to worry about a CGI budget or whatever. It's just whatever you can imagine it can happen. And then for comic books, it's the same idea, right? Because like literally anything you can imagine, as long as you can draw it, right? As long as you can get it on paper, then you're good. As
long as a professional artist can draw it. And I think that's where the double back of that is like when I was 18, I had the exact same idea. I read a comic book and I was like, there's no budget. You can do anything. And then you realize that sometimes that leads your poor artists into some very, just like your poor GMs into some very interesting scenarios where they have to imagine a thing that was never meant to be imagined.
Don't
and on a deadline.
Draw armies as too often if possible, because it's a lot of work.
I just wrote a horse into Star Trek #3 for the new series, and Colin literally looked at me and went, artists like to draw horses, right? And he had this like smile on the back of his face. Like, it's like the one thing they tell you, just don't make anybody draw horses.
The worst than that is horse riding a bicycle.
Yeah. Ooh, I should make the horse ride a bicycle.
No, don't do that. Your artist will let your front door and possibly stab you with their pen or stylus.
With paisley fur too, paisley all over. That'll help. So for those, one thing we like to do with continuing conversations is pretend that this is the first time someone watches or listens to the podcast. So what I want to do is just give a quick blurb on what year 5 was. So I'm going to go over to the actual module that was written by Fred Love. I'm going to just give you a quick blurb to catch everyone up so that we can then dive into where the story concept came from, Jody and Jackson's contributions to that, and then the evolution and transformation that Fred helped with. So here's year 5 for everyone. Fans have wondered ever since what thrilling adventures occurred during the final years of the 5-year mission. We all know the 5-year mission, right? What events propelled the main characters from where we left them at the end of the series to their new status quo at the start of Star Trek, the motion picture? Kirk gives up the captain's chair for the Admiralty. Spock leaves Starfleet to purge all remaining emotions through Kolinar. The Enterprise undergoes a major refit. The series' abrupt end left the details of those major developments to the imaginations of the fans. And that is until 2019 when IDW launched Star Trek Year 5, a sprawling space epic that wrapped up the Enterprise's 5-year odyssey and set the crew on a path toward their new status quo as depicted on the big screen. Fred, well written.
I have chills. Worked on the comic.
Yeah, wow, that was dope.
Well, that's high praise. I knew in the introduction there was so many references to the Odyssey and giving the series this mythological feel that needed to be worked into the introduction as well. So if that worked out well, that was just because the source material was so compelling.
Yeah. Well, to me, just that concept could draw anybody in, because I think we've all asked that question. If you watch Star Trek, as what happened in all those in between years. I've read a lot of the novels, and I have to personally say this comic has done a more phenomenal job in hooking me in that center in those key years. So
thank you so much. Yeah, it's very hard for me to even talk about Year 5 without getting a little emotional. It's an absolute dream project. I don't want to take up all of your time just by telling you all about how much Star Trek means to me, but Star Trek means everything to me. I have a really deep, my history with Star Trek goes back to my history with any fiction. It is my prime fiction in a lot of ways, in the way that like the Odyssey and its contemporaries were the first fiction for civilization. Like I really do look at it as my bedrock for a lot of storytelling. So when Colin feels similarly. And so when we got brought into work on Year 5 in the first place, alongside Jody and Brandon Easton and Jim McCann, and eventually Paul Cornell, as writers to come in here, we were all given that challenge straight away. And I think it's always really important to give credit for Year 5 to Chase Moroz, who, with Denton Tipton, came together and said, how can we do a Star Trek comic at a time when it's very, very hard to do licensed Star Trek comics that aren't direct adaptations of either Star Trek Discovery or Picard? How are you going to do, because it was pre-Picard, but this was during Picard. This is like contemporary too. How are we going to do this in a way that's exciting and actually carves new ground? Because they'd been stuck doing anthologies for a long time. Waypoint was sort of the only thing that they could get through that wasn't a direct adapt. And we'd been banging down the door on Star Trek for a long time, which is why we got brought in. But, we don't have the kind of licensing resume that Jody has, which is why we needed Jody. Like, we need somebody who actually knows what they're doing. But it was a really, like, you talking about that book in the past tense is wild to me, because I can't believe it's done. I can't believe we did it. Like, I genuinely, it still feels like a dream to me. Sorry.
I'm still worried we're not going to be able to finish it, even though it's finished.
I know, right?
Like, those things, like, knowing at the beginning how many issues the story was going to take, and like the beginning, middle, end of it, it's always just like, what's going to go wrong? What's going to stop us from like doing the thing? But nothing stopped us. We did the thing.
We did. Yeah.
Well, in fact, it means a lot to us. And just so you know, Jackson, Jim knows one of the things I like doing the most is making grown men cry. So if you actually do well up.
You're absolutely among family, because I do it all the time. I mean, when we talk about the different books that we're working on and whatnot, I mean, it's just Star Trek is in my soul from very beginning, when I was first reading. In fact, like we were talking about my son starting to read and looking at the comic book first. Like the first book I can remember reading was one of the old Star Trek photo novels, and it was either the Galileo 7 or Trouble with Tribbles. I don't remember which one. But I remember flipping, like I was still working on the words, but I saw the pictures and I could see Kirk and Spock and McCoy and everybody doing their thing. And I was like, oh, this is so amazing. And I mean, that was almost a comic book, right? The photo novels are
they are effectively comic books. Yes.
The Fumettis. And so I grew up with Star Trek, and it's completely embedded into everything that I do and think about. Right. So you are absolutely my friend. So don't feel shy at all about venting your heart about how much you love Star Trek and how much it means to you. That's what we're here for all day long.
And we're going to start the tour now, because we're going to talk about the passion, because it's wrapped up completely in the story. And so let's start with that conceptual idea. Jackson, you're the one who worked initially on that conceptual idea. I know you had another team member working with you also. Talk to us about that. Just launch us from there.
Yeah. So, I mean, first off, Colin isn't just like another team member. Just to be super clear, he's my partner in all things business. I have my wife, and I've got my Colin. Colin he's been my best friend since we were 18 years old. We are like attached at the brain. We call ourselves the hive mind. We rarely do interviews that aren't together. So he actually texted me earlier, because we were supposed to be in a D&D game right now. And he texted me, and I was like, oh, I have to be on this podcast. And he was like, did I forget about a podcast? I was like, no, this is a me thing. This is a me thing, dude. Don't worry about it.
Now. I don't care.
Trust me, he's going to be all amped up to D&D. Okay. It'd be chaos. He's our Tabaxi bard.
Yeah, crazy taxi card.
Yeah, you don't want to see him. But Colin and I, we work together. We run everything together, which doesn't happen a lot with writers in comics. You tend to have like solo writers and temporary team ups, and we are a straight up full on. We've been a team up for 15 years now. When we got brought in on year 5, it was because we'd been banging down the door for 3 years to try to do Star Trek. David Hedgecock at IDW was the co-publisher at the time and had actually launched my very first book when I was just starting an independent comics book called Freak Show. And back before I was even working with Colin, only thing I've ever published that wasn't with him, right? And David came to us. We were working on, I can say it now, we were working on the Transformers license at the time. And truthfully, Transformers is not a license I have any attachment to whatsoever. I have never watched a Transformers thing and enjoyed it. It's nothing against Transformers. It's just not my thing. And that was why they brought us in. They brought us in because they were like, we want to do something totally different with Transformers. Just go totally nuts, go really weird with it. And Colin and I were like, great. And we did about 1.5 years of development with that. And it kind of felt like banging our heads up against a wall because we were fighting the license. And that made sense because we aren't really we weren't really trained in license work. We didn't spend a lot of time in license work. So we were just kind of like shooting for the stars and seeing what happened. The only license we'd really worked on up to that point was Tomb Raider, outside of like DC, which was not a great experience. So we were really gun shy about license. And Hedgecock came to me and he said at WonderCon, I think 2017, maybe 2016, came to me and said, hey, how's Transformers going? I was like, I don't know, man, maybe. I love the editor, and he goes, well, is there anything else like that we do that you might want to play around with instead? And I said, and I just looked at him and I was like, truthfully, I know Mike Johnson is on this and you don't do anything other than Mike's books, but Star Trek. And I love Mike. He's really a friend of mine. So I don't want to I'm not going to take work from Mike, but if you have room to play next to Mike, Colin and I would kill it. We'd be your guys. Like, absolutely, please let us do this. And we came in and we pitched this 3-book line in 2016 or 2017 that was a crazy thing with all these different tie-ins and all this book and years and set like after DS9 and Voyager and Next Gen and was really gonna sequelize all the stuff. And then they right before it got approved, like almost a year in, Star Trek approved, greenlit Star Trek Picard. And they were like, we're definitely not allowed to play with any of those toys now because Picard gets to run the continuity for all of that. So the whole line is dead. Goodbye. And we thought that was it for us in Star Trek. And they came back to us with Waypoint and they said, hey, would you do one? Chase Morodes, who was the guy behind a lot of that, the sort of genius editor, came to us and said, hey, do you want to do just a short? Any Star Trek short? And we were like, we pitched him a story from the perspective of Data's cat Spot. And we ended up doing it. And it ended up, sorry, my wife is in traffic and it's hard for her and she's texting me a lot. Apologies. But we got that short out. That showed that we could do Star Trek, which was exciting. We weren't going to try to Transformers it. And then they called us up maybe 6 months later and said, hey, we have this idea. What if you end Star Trek? What does that look like? When you just take Star Trek, the original series, what does this last season of that look like? How do we attach it to the motion picture and give the original series the ending that it deserved? We're going to put together a writer's room. We're going to do it like a TV show, which I just thought was genius. I was like, that's what a cool idea, because it doesn't isolate your writers off on its own space. An interesting idea, especially because Star Trek, the original series, did not have a writer's room. It was a freelance show. So it had there was no writer's room for this series ever. So we were the first.
Until us.
Yeah. And they said, hey, you're gonna pitch to write in the room, but also if you want, you can pitch to quote show run, which means you're just going to, within the comics premise here, just means you're going to set the overall arc. You're going to build what the beginning is and what the end is and sort of where the midpoint is so that the thing has a spine that then we can attach great writer-driven one-shot issues off of. So basically able to make the space for the individual writers, but also tell an ongoing story across. And we said, hell yes, let's go. And hoped that we would get in the room. But as we were building it out, we found ourselves in revisiting TOS and in thinking about what we loved and what we thought we spun out a whole season of TV. And Colin and I have done a lot of television and development, especially and in animation. And we knew some of these forms. And so we once we found Gary Seven and we found the Tholians and we found the Originalists and we found the, we found what would be eventually become the Icosa, though that comes out of a pitch and comes out of a gym. And there's a lot that was developed well after us on that. We sort of put all these things together and said, well, I think we've actually got something here. Put that together into a really robust pitch that I just pulled up to see how close it was to what Fred wrote, because it's honestly very similar. It starts with that same thing about being like, we know where they're going to start, we know where they're going to end, but we have no idea how they got there. And I was like, same. So we, this is back when, back before Gary Seven, when I was pitching Garth of Izar as the villain, which we ended up blowing up because we got the Gary Seven idea and thought it was much more interesting. But yeah, we got the gig. But the funny part is, and this is where the Jody of it all comes in.
Yeah, can I tell this story? Okay.
Yes, please. So basically, just my story ends with I've turned in the outline.
Okay, so a little background for me. Like, I love Star Trek, not as nearly as much as Jackson and Colin do, but like Star Trek connects me to actually both of my grandparents, because my dad's mom is like hardcore science fiction and especially Star Trek fan. So I used to like grow up going to her house and watching Next Gen and DS9 with her. My other grandmother, who's my mom's mom, grew up as a kid in Boston and knew Leonard Nimoy as a kid. He was friends with her older brother. She says they dated. That's a debate among the family. I choose to believe she did because I like that story better. So I'd actually pitched to Waypoint early on and had a story approved, but it hadn't. The series was wrapping up before I had the chance to do it. So Denton Tipton, who Jackson mentioned earlier, who's an editor I'd worked on for Orphan Black and X-Files Origins, he reached out to me about being in this writer's room. And I knew Jackson and Colin were like the potential showrunners, quote unquote, for this. And I would feel really bad getting to work on their dream project if they weren't there. And B, I knew my schedule was going to be insane that year. So I said I would like to do the room, but I sort of made it contingent on Jackson and Colin being the people running the room, because they were the ones I wanted to do it with. Like, obviously amazing project, but I wanted to do it with two of my best friends in comics. So Denton eventually reached out to me and was like, well, good news, you're in the room, Jackson and Colin got it. And I was like, great. So I texted Jackson and I'm like, hey, I guess we're doing this thing. And Jackson's like, what?
Meanwhile, I am waiting. Like, I know the call is coming that day and I am waiting for the call. And I don't know that we've gotten the gig. I think maybe we've gotten in the room. I certainly don't know that we're the showrunners. And especially at that time, this was the biggest gig Colin and I had ever gotten in comics. We'd never been on an ongoing series before. We'd been really kicked around at DC a lot on some, like, a lot of cancellations and small books. Tomb Raider wasn't a great experience for us. So we were very nervous about coming onto this and like doing a good job. And because it was something that mattered to us. And we get this text through.
Like, congratulations.
Nervous energy, some of the best energy, though.
But that was really cool because I got to tell two people I adore that they got their dream job, and like, yeah, it was awesome. I danced around my office and we called each other and freaked out, and then tried to pretend like we hadn't been told when they called us. And that's how it all started. And basically, the process, to make the answer really, really short, the process was really cool because it was literally just one day a year for 2 years. The whole room got together, and Colin and I already knew what was going to happen. We were able to map it out on a board very quickly and be like, hey, here's what the show is going to be. Here's how we're going to start it. Here's how we're going to end it. Here's the issues that we're going to take. That's half the book. Half the book is written by Colin and I. The other half of the book is spread along the room. And then what we would do is we would take 2 issues, put them together, and have that be an episode. And so what ended up being the greatest thing about the room was when we got to shut up, like, Colin and I would just walk in and be like, okay, here's the briefing. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we've approved with Star Trek. Here's what everybody's excited about. Now, what do you guys want to do? And we got to hear Jody's great pitches and Brandon's great pitches and Jim's great pitches and just talk. And by and large, the first pitch out the gate was the one we went with, because like normally the writers were pretty sure of what they wanted to do and were excited to do it. So we got to spend most of those days, those single days, just hanging around the Star Trek archive, talking about Star Trek with a bunch of writers we respected. It was the absolute dream job, like truly a dream job. nerding out.
Yeah. And then they gave us, and then they let us go into the merch room where they have everything they've ever produced for Star Trek. That was a crazy time.
So from there, let's keep it 1,000 feet level for a second and take it over to Jim.
Yeah.
Jim, then how did Modiphius get involved with this idea of doing a collaboration based on this graphic novel?
You want to go there already? I wanted to hear more about the sausage making of the actual comic book.
I do. The thing is, we have about 45 minutes, and where
I'm so sorry. We're so talking. I apologize.
No, that's all right. I would eat this up all day long because as a writer, right, I want to know what was the sausage. What was the outline like? Did you have a broad strokes outline for the entire thing, and then writers pitch stuff to kind of fill in the blanks and stuff? But
that was exactly right. Yeah. We knew specifically we're going to do the premiere, or like Colin and I do issue 1 and 2. Then we're going to come back for issue 7, 8. Then we're going to come back for issue 11, 12. Then we're going to come back for 13, 14. But then we're going to leave for a bunch of issues and come back we left these spaces open, and they knew where the points in the story were going to be. So they knew how to tell these stories within those frameworks. But then from that point, Jody gets to come in, and like Jody's pitch was, Jody talked about that waypoint pitch.
Yeah, and I knew I had a story that had been approved for Trek, and, I hadn't gotten to write yet. And it ended up tying in perfectly for where my story was going to go in the first year, because it was all about communication and hearing people's thoughts instead of what they're saying. But it's at the same time when they have a young Tholian on board who they're trying to learn how they speak and how to communicate with them. So it all just sort of worked out perfectly. And, also I got to write Uhura as like this saving the day, which is...
I mean, and that was the other secret of the framework was Colin and I came in and we said, well, we know that whenever we come in, Kirk is the main character. Mm-hmm. Like that was in our outline from straight up, because people remember TOS as an ensemble show, but it was not. When it was if you go back to that show is the William Shatner show, and it becomes the Leonard Nimoy show over time, but it was the William Shatner show. And so when you come in and you're going to write Captain Kirk, and we were trying to do what TOS did, we had to not step out of the idea of like the TOS of memory and try to do the literal TOS, which means centering Kirk. And so what that let us do was kind of have our cake and eat it too. Do something that TOS didn't used to be able to do, which were episodes that were really from other perspectives. So we could say every time we come in, it's going to be a Kirk show. And sometimes we'll use Spock and sometimes we'll use other characters, but like by and large, it's going to be a Kirk show, which means that every writer got to find their favorite characters and be like, I want to do Uhura, or I want to do Scotty, or I want to do Sulu or Chekhov, and we ended up over the course of the series getting to do, like if you look, every time a new writer comes in, it's an episode that's centered on a new member of the cast who hasn't gotten a spotlight. Every member of the cast is a spotlight issue over the course of it because of the way it was structured. But that came from planning. That wasn't like, oh, it was a happy accident. Like we built all that from the front so that we knew we could get there.
To me, it was seamless. Cool. There wasn't like hard jerks when that happened, though, which was really nice. It was still this overall story, which was really seamless to me.
It's surrounded by great writers, man.
Yeah. So, more modern audiences are used to that sort of shifts in TV shows. And again, like Jackson was saying, that's sort of like the memory people have, but that's coming more from the movies than the original show. So we sort of got to, with the core story focusing on Kirk, with the, other stories that we all were writing sort of lean into more the impression that people had.
Interesting. That's great. And just for my reference, as we move toward getting Modiphius involved here, from that text where you said, okay, you got the gig to the final delivery of the last manuscript, or from beginning to end, what was that time commitment? Was that 2 years, 5 years? How much time did you?
I turned in the Star Trek Year 5 show running outline on November 4th, 2018. And we completed Star Trek Year 5, number 25 in, I believe, July of 2021.
Yeah, we did have a delay for a bit when the pandemic first started, because a lot of comic publishers stopped publishing for a while because the distributor wasn't operating. Comic shops were all closed. So it probably would have been closer to an even like 2 years just for the production standpoint. And then like the few months, because our first writer's room was end of January.
In 2019.
I think. So it was like only a few months after, you turned in that pitch. So.
Yeah, we had, the plan was 2 years. Because of the pandemic, it went for 3.
Sure. No, that makes sense. Yeah, so that's quite an investment of time, right? For something that you're so passionate about, so much energy that you have to spend over a long, sustained period of time.
Really? Something I'm sure you all must know about in role-playing games. I mean, isn't that that's the whole ball game?
Yeah, day in and day out, absolutely. Cool. Yeah. So now, Michael, getting to your question here. So when Modiphius got involved, it was early 2020. So you guys were well into the series, but you weren't done yet. I think you were like on issue 21 or 22, somewhere in that frame. And I want to say it was like the genesis of it was Chris Birch, the president of Modiphius, coming to me one day and said, "Hey, you're the project manager now, so let's do some cool stuff." And he said, "What do you think about getting to do some sort of tie-in with IDW?" And I was like, "Well, we haven't done anything with the comic books yet. That'd be kind of cool." And I was like, "Do I know anybody at IDW who might have any kind of connection?" And it worked out that I had a connection with Rich Handley, who was doing all the editing on the Eagle Moss Hero Collector comic books. And I threw a email at him and I said, "Do you know anybody at IDW who we might be able to connect with to do something cool Star Trek, comic wise, RPG wise?" I think this is how it worked. Correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a couple of years and the pandemic, and I have a short-term memory because I need to have a short-term memory for all the project management I do. I need to have that. I have to compartmentalize my brain, otherwise I'll never forget anything. I'll never get any work done. But so I think Rich was the initial connect to possibly you, Jackson, and Colin, and maybe even Jody as well. And we just started kicking it around on email a little bit. And initially, Rich was going to do the bulk of the writing, and then I asked Fred if he was interested. And fortunately, Fred, you said you were, which I was really grateful for, because you were one of my regular go-tos for Star Trek stuff, especially when weird stuff came up. Like, I got these really weird things coming up. Can you do this? And it's like, "Oh yeah, absolutely." And you always deliver, and it's always great. And then Rich unfortunately had to drop out because he had some other commitments that he had to tend to. And so like the bulk of the work, Fred, dropped on you, which I knew you were more than up for. And I was able to lead it a little bit, but I mostly handed it off to you and the IDW team, because I knew I trust my team, right? That's the whole Star Trek thing, is you trust your team. You put a team together and then you trust them to get it done. And of course they do, which is great. But so I think initially it was Chris telling me, go talk to somebody at IDW. I talked to Rich. Rich got us in touch with you folks. And then we got the ball rolling from that point. And, gosh, I have to think, and Fred, I'm going to turn this over to you to get your perspectives here, but I don't really remember any hiccups at all. I mean, you all were so generous with your time and your content and your art, and just like you were so professional and so easy to work with, that I was like, this is like one of the easiest. I mean, I had 14 or 15 projects on my plate at the time. And this was like, oh, I'm really passionate about this because I love the comic book as it was coming out. I just couldn't wait for the next issue to come out. But Fred, fill in some perspective here. Like, talk about getting the assignment, and then getting involved in it, and then getting down into the weeds as we were getting because we were getting draft manuscripts from you folks for the last few issues. Like, you gave us a great data dump of all the stuff, which was a godsend. And then you were able to kind of filter out the last few issues, even though they hadn't gone to full blown. I don't know what the term is, but getting the full art. And I think you may have even sent us some pre-color draft layouts too. But Fred, go ahead. Yeah, give me some thoughts here.
Yeah, so Jody and Jack both mentioned at different points that this is sort of a dream assignment for you. That was almost like the response that I had when Jim asked me to come on board. He's like, "Hey, we've got some comic books. Do you want some Star Trek comics? Do you want to turn that into a Star Trek RPG product?" And it was just an emphatic yes from the beginning, because I've been a huge fan of Star Trek tie-in fiction from the time that I was a little kid. I've got a shelf full of comics and video games and novels, and so when I think about the year for tie-in specifically, two things jump out. My first question was, are we going to get to use that beautiful art? And I was so gratified that the answer was yes. I think the art, comic books is a visual medium, and the art was so wonderful in that it looked like the old sets and the original cast, but also had this grand scale and these really imaginative ships and creatures and settings, and sort of an updated for a modern audience. And so I thought that would give you, being able to use that art would give the Year 5 tie-in an identity of its own. And then another thing that I love about Star Trek Adventures is we take quotes from the TV show and the movies, and we begin each subheading with a quote from those characters. And I really wanted to go through and pull out a quote from comic and use that dialogue in that same way that we use the dialogue from the TV shows and the movies. And I thought that I hope anyway, that those elements combined gave the 5 tie-in its own identity in the Star Trek Adventures line.
Yeah, I think go ahead, Jackson.
Oh, I was just going to geek out about the art for a second, just because I have it behind me. Stephen Thompson was the artist who sort of started Year 5 and who did the sort of like core issues by and large. But, we had a whole great team of artists from across the spectrum of like classic Star Trek people like J.K. Woodward, all the way to, brand new artists coming in on Star Trek. So that was a really lovely process in general for us, because Steven set such a high bar, and then everybody who came in, I was thinking of Sylvia Califano, who was just outstanding, but also had a more cartoony style, but it allowed it to like shape in. Same thing with Christopher Jones. Like, there's a breadth of art in Year 5. It's not all the same art style, and you couldn't be Steven if you tried. Like, Steven's work is singular. It's specific. It comes from the sort of Irish comic style. He's a really wonderful artist. But truly, he set a bar that everybody just lifted. Like it was really a proving ground for a lot of artists who were like, Star Trek can be more than quote unquote people in rooms, which is what I think a lot of Star Trek art, like a lot of artists think Star Trek is, which is why they don't work on it as much. But it really can be more than that.
Oh, sorry, but just the fact we got to see all these artists do their best Star Trek rather than trying to come up with some sort of house style for the book. I think that's really what made it work. So even though the different artists look different, it all just meshes together so beautifully, just because it's like the best Star Trek that they're going to, I don't want to limit their futures or anything, but
who knows? We might get some of them back.
The story, though, again, there was no sharp jerks or sharp left turns with it, as you said. I mean, I've collected comics since I was 8 years old. So you get used to art transition and you learn how to write the story. So it worked out really well. One of the biggest things that, of course, Star Trek is known for is social commentary. And so I did have a question that I wanted to ask while we have the writers here. What was the overall social commentary message you were trying to accomplish with this? And I know there's probably other ones weaved in with different writers coming in, but can we talk about that a little bit?
Oh, 1,000%. Yeah. So that's why Gary 7. When we came to Gary 7, it was because we realized that there was a great chance to do something specific to not like, okay, let me back this up. 1960s Star Trek is telling social stories within a 1960s context. So its stories are told about 1960s social issues because that's what's going on. Modern Star Trek is in a modern storytelling mode, trying to tell modern stories in that respect. And before Strange New Worlds was doing that on a non-episodic basis. And so, which was, in the context in which we were working on the show. We had a really unique challenge, which was to take the old Star Trek storytelling model, episodic 60s episodic television model, and apply modern social commentary inside of that and tell those kind of stories forward. And with every single issue, we asked what that was, right? We always tried to look and say like, okay, yeah, but what is the story about? Colin and I are always character guys, but on Star Trek, especially this Star Trek, we were also meaning guys. So we were looking into it and saying, okay, if, for instance, Jody's issue, her first episode is all about a device that makes people tell the truth and how much or hear the truth more accurately. And the more that happens, the more that people are stripped of their ability to like let the little white lies that make their world go on, the more violent and unstable and sort of scared they are. And so the story tells something very, very truthful about the nature of lying and the nature of the way that we are kind to one another, and that sometimes those lines aren't as blurred as you think. It's also a story about communicating with the other. It has all of these. I mean, you can dig into Jody's story and find like several layers of like social meaning, even before you get to the core character meaning, which is about Bright Eyes, our new Tholian character, and Uhura finding a friendship that will save the galaxy, right? So like all of that stuff is, built into episode. The overall of Star Trek Year 5 then had to be about something modern that we had to say about Star Trek. To me, it was like, it wasn't enough to be like, I want to say democracy is damaged, because like, obviously democracy is damaged. Let's talk about it. And that's where the originalists come from. That's where the idea of the Starfleet or the Federation election and running that through, which because of the delays in the book became much more direct a commentary on the rise of Trump than we even expected it to be. That was really not.
My Harry Mudd issues, I think, came out in October and November of 2020. So that was not planned.
Yeah, we really truthfully did not. That was not how we were trying to do things. But we did want to talk about democracy. We did want to talk about Trump, but we wanted to do it, behind some lenses. And then really like the ultimate core, and I can't say too much about this without spoiling the book for anybody who's listening and hasn't read the books, but ultimately the true enemy of Star Trek Year 5 is what I think the true enemy of Star Trek is in large respect, and that is nostalgia. I think the book is about the ways in which we limit the myths that we have created because of the nostalgia we have for why they were created in the first place, or how they were created in the first place. I feel this way very strongly because Colin and Jody too. We all work in what I think is effectively modern myth making. It is a handed down story with repetitive characters who are going to appear in different guises. I mean, these are like Grant Morrison is quite right on the super gods element. And I think in Star Trek, we have another set of super gods who teach us a different set of values and who align to a different set of sort of like post-religious principles. I think they're really important. I don't think Star Trek's just cool. I think Star Trek's deeply important. So when we were talking about like, how do we pay respect to that and do something that feels like it makes the story to some degree about the necessity for Star Trek Year 5 to exist in the first place, then the story really should be about how we can't let what we have sit in stasis. We can't put everything we love in a little bottle and keep it there forever, because that's not how democracy is supposed to work. That's not how family is supposed to work. That's not how society is supposed to work. And it's not how Star Trek's supposed to work. So nostalgia is the villain of Star Trek Year 5 and is thus our commentary.
On a less meta level, it's very much about how individuals can find themselves with the option to stagnate or the option to become something more. And I think even if you're not like being like, oh, this is about Star Trek and how Star Trek like keep being Star Trek, but you can still look at the characters and being, it's like they're at the point, they're at a big turning point, and the choices they make will determine whether they continue to grow or they just keep being what they are. And does that even fit in the universe they're coming back to?
I got to pass this over to Jim, because we talk a lot with Star Trek Adventures about this subject, and even trying to get a more diverse range of people even playing the game. So Jim, what are you hearing there that matches what you're noticing in game development even now when you're developing the modules?
It's just it's interesting that you're talking about the whole nostalgia thing. Where I was going was, I wonder if that's the reaction to a lot of fans to the newer Star Trek shows, right? They want the nostalgia, and they want Star Trek to be in their nice little box that they're familiar with from back in the day. They resist the new Discovery and the new Picard and the new Lower Decks, Prodigy, et cetera. And they're like, oh, this is Star Trek, but it's not the Star Trek I know. I want the Star Trek I know, and they want that little box. But it's like, no, Star Trek is bigger than that. It blows up the box, and it's expansive. It's IDIC. It's everything. It's much bigger than what we've seen. We can build on it and expand on it and make it different. And that's what we do with the RPG. Is I constantly try to find more diverse voices to bring into the game, to write for the game, and to play the game too. We're constantly trying to to build the fan base and create new people, get involved in the game and show them what a great storytelling venue it is and how much you can learn. I think the pandemic has helped us in a lot of ways, weirdly, because so many people moved to online playing because they couldn't play in person. And so they're meeting people online all around the world. And it's amazing. It's super, super humbling and gratifying, but mostly humbling to be able to go onto like YouTube or Twitch or something and see people in like Germany and Africa and Australia playing the game. I can't understand the language that they're playing in, but I can see the dice on the table. I can see that we have the modules and the books on the table, and they're clearly playing it and clearly doing Star Trek and having a great time. And it's like, wow, it's not just the game. It's Star Trek is binding so many different people all around the world together. And it's just an amazing experience. And I'm sure the comic books are like, I don't know if you have translations. I'm assuming you do. But,
we do. Yeah.
I mean, it's so easy because like you were saying at the very beginning, the books themselves, if you just take all the words out, it's still telling that story panel after panel. You don't need German or Russian or French or Japanese, the language in there. I mean, it certainly helps, but you can still get the story. And for that to be so universal across the entire world, it's just super, super awesome. And I just love the fact that that's what we have now with Star Trek. But boy, that's a really great, deep commentary about how nostalgia can be dangerous.
Well, I'm glad you said it too before I do my second reread of it now, because I'm going to have that in the top of my mind as I go through a whole nother time, and I'm going to enjoy it. Totally.
There you go. Now you'll see what we were doing. I do. I have a bit that kind of pops off of what Jim was just saying that happened to Jody and I both at San Diego Comic-Con. So the first year that we came out with year 5 and we had the first issue, I think we'd only been out for the first couple of issues. And we got the whole writers team together, and I'm standing next to Brandon and we were just sitting there doing our signing. And this woman with pink hair comes down the way and like on her walker, and she turns, and Brandon, who is an encyclopedia for like especially like old Star Trek. Like he was one of our, like he had a lot of utility in the room. Brandon is a deeply excellent writer with really excellent ideas and great follow through, but he also like knows, he can like see somebody on site and be like, oh, that's that actor or that actress for like this like one episode of like 1960s television. And she walks by and he goes, are you Bijou Trimble?
He actually saw her name on the walker.
Yeah. Oh, wow. He goes, are you Bijou Trimble? And for those of you who don't know, Bijou Trimble is the first Star Trek fan. Maybe not the first Star Trek fan, but is like the first in Star Trek fans. She is I think technically and like canonically the first shipper. I think she wrote the like first like Kirk Spock fan fiction, or at the very least like helped curate it. Like she was deep inside of the Star Trek fan community when it was first developing out.
Fandom in a way, I would say.
She and her cadre developed fandom and sort of built it into the thing that we know. And we owe her an enormous debt of gratitude. So I freaked out. Brandon freaked out. Jody freaked out. We all freaked out because we all knew who Bijou was. And I was like, oh my God, thank you for coming to the signing. Like, let's sign. But then also like, can I just come out? Can we get a photo? Like, can we talk? And we did. And we took a photo for a little bit. And then she kind of took me to the side. And we were just talking for a little bit. I got to like walk around a little part of the con with Bijou. And while it was we were sort of going on, I think her husband had like gone to another booth, and she was like, I don't know where that old guy went. I gotta find him. That was literally like how she talks. And we walked over and we're walking around and we're talking about Star Trek. And I'm like, it's wild for me to, as like a relatively young person to be entering a thing that you helped author. Like it's a real trip to be coming into this and trying to build out what the last year of year 5 of Star Trek should be. I hope we kind of get it right for people like you who like knew this stuff when it was first starting. Like, I hope it's accessible to you. And she said, I mean, I'm sure it will be. I love this stuff, and it'll stick with me forever. She's like, but what I really want is for it to be accessible to new people. And it's why I don't understand so much of the fandom rejecting the idea of new Star Trek. Sort of out of hand, that by saying like, oh, it's not my Star Trek, right? Okay. Discovery doesn't have to be your Star Trek. None of this has to be your Star Trek, right? Because your Star Trek can be TOS or Next Generation or Deep Space Nine or Enterprise if you want. Like any Star Trek can be your Star Trek, right? No judgments. But if we don't create new Star Trek, then what's going to happen to our kids? What's going to happen to the next generation, literally the next generation who needs their Star Trek? It's not for us anymore. It's for them. And we're building the base. And to hear somebody who like invented fandom, right? To hear somebody like that say that so just directly, like, it's so weird that they won't get on board. They should just get on board. Why not?
Easy too.
And she didn't have a problem getting on board. She just came to our signing like any fan, and if we had spotted her name, we would have just thought she was a nice old lady who was a fan of Star Trek, like so many others. And yeah,
I mean, this is perfect. I mean, I kind of dreamt for a better segue into talking about the book characters now, because now that you've said this and gave that real life story, now we can talk about the originalists, which I've been why. Right? The concept, because now, okay, everyone who Star Trek fans, listen to this carefully. There's deep meaning in this book. Talk to us about the originalists, and I'm going to pass it over to Fred to talk about kind of your adaptation and understanding of it too, Fred, in context of Star Trek Adventures. So where did the idea come from, and I know that there's Jody, you have some input on it too. You had spoken to me a little bit about it. So whoever wants to start.
Oh, I think Jody should start. Jody wrote probably the issue that is the most sort of deeply embedded in the originalists.
Hold on, I'm pulling up
content.
I have Harry Mudd's political ad, and that's probably the
nice.
I can just read this. I felt so gross writing this. I'll just say.
Remember, you like wrote me a text being like, "I don't think I can write this issue right now. This is a hard thing to write in the middle of October of 2020." Like just right up against the election. It was bad.
Yeah.
I'm going to show his picture. I'll share screen and show his picture while you read the political ad. Because
I can't do a good impression, so it's just going to sound like me. But these are not I do not approve of this message. We owe a lot to the proud peoples who formed this federation. Those who laid the groundwork for all we hold dear. Those who came first. Remember when being first meant something? When a man earned his place in the stars? The ideals of the Federation are noble, true. But does the current state of the Federation really reflect the wishes of its founders? I'm Harcourt Fenton Mudd, and I promise to raise the Federation up to the glorious heights it was always meant to reach. Vote Mudd. Vote for a future that we'll build together. Yeah.
I can't imagine where we had the idea for the originalists. But I mean, truthfully, that whole idea, right, of Star Trek being a place where humanity has evolved past its need for possessions and competition and a lot of the things that we like. Star Trek supposes that, and certainly Gene Roddenberry supposes that. But then most Star Trek stories say, but there were individual failings. Look at this mother who can't get over her grief, who's going to kill a crystal entity, right? I always go back to Silicon Avatar for whatever reason. It's a really good example of this, where it's we have this very, very evolved humanity that still has absolutely no idea how to process grief. Star Trek does that a lot, actually. And I think one of the things we wanted to do was say, okay, if there's enough people like that, then you could appeal to the worst parts of the Federation mindset, that being, hey, 5 great planets, Andoria, Earth, Proxima, Tellar, and Vulcan, all came together and founded a collective, for the better good. That's incredible. Once we start involving Bolia and Trill and Bajor, are we really doing good by the people who this was actually started to protect? Obviously, that's a terrible argument and not an argument that I would make in the real world, but it's an argument that I can see.
The new Ken Burns PBS thing about US and the Holocaust. Because that stuff doesn't go away, because it's part of human nature. It's part of the base level of humanity to get jealous and defensive about certain things that we shouldn't get jealous and defensive about. And we just felt like you had to apply that to Star Trek. It felt like it would be dishonest not to, especially because by the next generation, it really seems to be a different conversation. By the next generation, the Federation has grown so large that this conversation couldn't be made. But at TOS, you can. It's still a pretty small Federation.
And the fact that it wasn't just the humans fucking think things up,
Right.
that this the story with Mud starts on Andoria. So Andoria is deeply tied into the originalist movement, and that's where their non-criminal presidential candidate eventually comes from.
And that is
right. You
yes,
created the Andorian character, Jody.
Yes, her name Renai is an anagram of my grandmother's name, the one who knew Leonard Nimoy, and I thought it was kind of funny to make her an Andorian because we know the history of Andorians and Vulcans. So
that's brilliant. I love it. Let me ask a question just so we get into Fred Love's head a little bit. Can you just talk a little bit? I mean, you read this comic, you read this graphic novel, and now you have to glean and transform it into playable characters, into digestible bits for a game master. Again, I'm just, for those people who are playing or game mastering, I hope you were listening to this whole premise of nostalgia and originalist, because it's going to change how I use this module, that's for sure. Fred, talk to us about how you reverse engineer it.
Yeah, so we started out just by reading everything, and I just took notes as I went, highlighting the coolest bits. What would be the coolest bits to have in a game? And so I made categories for ships and technology. I made categories for characters. And then we also did factions. And the originalists were presented as a faction in the IDW or in the year 5. And so obviously, I wouldn't suggest that the player characters, if they're Starfleet characters, be members of the originalists, but it could be a really fun foil. Let's say that an originalist member of the Federation Council suddenly cuts the mission of their starship. With one of the originalists think that exploring stars is a waste of resources and a way of provoking the Fem's enemies. So what if suddenly your player characters had an entire mission and pulled out from under them? That would be a suggestion that I would have for games out there looking to stuff to the table.
Okay, got it. Good. Sorry, you're in some sort of tachyon web flux thing.
Oh no,
so you're aware.
Oh no,
Gary 7.
But we resolved things with the Tholians, man.
It had to be. I loved what you said though, because I think sometimes people, some people want to play what we now are referring to as an unaligned game, where some people actually want to play the hairy muds, and that's great because Star Trek Adventures is making that possible for people. I think for a lot of players, and Jim, you can talk to it more than I can, who love the original series, this actually could be a really interesting way to address the issue if you have a bunch of players who are only in love with TOS, and to creatively use this guide to stretch their wings, right, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's still, we haven't gotten there yet, but we're trying to figure out where to fit it in. There's still a huge component of the original series fans and RPG fans who really want to play a Horta player character, right? We haven't figured out where to fit in a Horta yet, but like in this year 5 series, you had Tholians being such a key component of the story. I was like, oh, Fred, we totally got to throw in Tholian player characters. Like, I haven't heard a lot of people saying, oh, I want to play a Tholian, but why not? Right? I mean, go for it. Bright Eyes is such an amazing character. It's like, sure, why not have Bright Eyes on a Starfleet vessel doing stuff? That's totally within the Star Trek vein.
I geeked out so hard at the idea of a playable Tholian species. So, okay, I need to back up here because I have done something that Colin will just like ravage me for if I do not say it straight away. Savage me. Colin will not ravage me. He will savage me. Here's what's up. Before I was ever writing any kind of Star Trek, it was even a glint in the mind's eye that I might ever get to write Star Trek, like well back. I was right after I met my wife, and she'd left town for a couple of months to go like pack up her stuff and finish up college. And I was basically here in LA in our like little apartment being like, not sure what I'm doing. And I didn't have a lot to work on. And I'd watched a lot of Star Trek Deep Space Nine lately. And I got out of Deep Space Nine and I was like, I have questions and I'm going to run them out as a role-playing game. And I'm going to do a bunch of different ships. I'm going to do like a Federation ship, and I'm going to do a Klingon ship, and I'm going to do a Dominion refugee ship. And I'm going to do all these parties. I'm going to bring it together. It'll be like a 10-episode thing. It'll be fun. There was no Star Trek Adventures at the time. Star Trek role-playing was kind of bereft at the moment. And so I had to create something. I modded White Wolf. I like went in and rebuilt White Wolf and then designed a ship combat system and then ran this game. And this game started as a 10-person, 10-episode game, and it grew to a 35-person, 150-episode game. It got really extraordinary and really large and became a living universe. And we did 7-8 years of Star Trek history out of it. And the Tholians.
Yeah.
And the Tholians were to some degree our villain. They were our long-term thing. We were doing a thing with the Tholians, not what we did in year 5, but we were doing stuff like it. I never finished the game, so my players still don't know what I was doing. But turns out you get busy. But Star Trek didn't, I was trying, I built the system. Tholians really couldn't be built in the system. It was just really hard. They're just different. They're biologically different. They have really different abilities and ways of communicating. So I was I don't know. Instead, I made them a medical mystery. And I had a character who was a doctor, played by my friend Adi Kabigting, who would come in and would do these her games where she would work on a Tholian and try to figure out how a Tholian worked. And she had Tholians in stasis, and her whole game was collecting Tholians and learning how they worked. And when we started the comic, we took those medical reports and made them canon because they were an easy way for us to be well, how does all the science of Tholians work? I don't know, but I have this friend with a very medical mind who's been working it out for years. So I just called Adi and I was can I use all that canon? And she was yeah, go for it. And so we brought all that into the game, which is where the stasis beams come from. It's where the sub-zero phasers come from. Is a lot that stuff was all stuff from our game. So our game actually, an RPG came in and influenced year 5, which then found its way into Star Trek Adventures. And then there was a playable Tholian character that was built on medical and build out stuff from our White Wolf game. The actual RPG Ouroboros here is insane.
I gotta ask Fred then. Fred, take it, please. What were you thinking?
I'm just so gratified to hear that. I think if this conversation proves anything, it's that you can tell, Star Trek is more one thing, and you can tell great Trek stories on the screen, in comics and a table, and I'm just so gratified to hear that element from such a long-term campaign found in Star Trek Adventures. I love that story. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's man, I would want you to go on more, Fred. Again, I think your connection isn't clear enough. But with what Jackson just said, and maybe you can talk to it a little bit, Fred. When you reverse engineered it, and Jackson, you saw the stats. You have the actual Star Trek Adventures modules there. So I'm looking right now at the Tholian Elder on page 17, and I'll just go ahead and pop it up on screen so we can chat a little bit about it. Then, the one question I have is, Fred, you reverse engineered this character here. Jackson, how did the minds match up, do you think? Now, Jackson, thinking back to what you just told us, and then Fred, talk to us a little about what you noticed about the Tholians that stuck out to you, why you wanted to engineer them like this.
Well, reading... Yeah, go ahead. From reading the comics, as I recall, they spent a lot of time. There's a point where they're actually climbing the Tholian web, vacuum of space. I knew that needed to be something that to be accounted for. I also tried to account for what we know of the Tholians from what we see on screen on series and Enterprise, sort of mashing them all together. And then the chapter in the Star Trek Adventures core rulebook that tells you how to create NPCs. And so I guess those 3 elements, the comics, the canon, and then the way you build characters in Star Trek Adventures, I had to kind of meld those 3 elements together and come up with a stat block. And hopefully it's close to what Jackson would have had in mind, would have been for his own long campaign. Yeah,
I mean, it's wild to look at it because it is fundamentally distinct from the way that my game built stuff. So it's really just looking at where do we have connective tissue? And one of the things, and this is just not a thing that was ever established in Star Trek canon, but I established in my game and then brought over into year 5, was that the Tholians would be immune to vacuum, which was just me looking at if you have a crystalline structure for your body and you're not dealing with oxygen or heat in the same kinds of ways, and especially if you generate heat from within yourself, which is what Tholians do. We know that, at least from Enterprise, that this was a great way to just say, okay, well, that's something that they can do that no other species can do. Like those Tholian webs, they can walk on them like spiders. That'll be fun. It's big and crazy for my game players. Now my ships can get swarmed by Tholian NPCs that they can fight along the, through the hallways. It can be very like First Contact. It felt like a very fun like way to do that kind of thing. I even had ships that like developed anti-Tholian web superstructure technology so that they could like fly through Tholian webs, all kinds of stuff designed around that. And so the immune to vacuum was really important there in terms of building that out. Then we brought that into year 5 as an action beat, because it was like, oh, well, that makes for a really great comic book beat, because one of our core principles on this book, we had 4 core principles, and one of them was be visual, right? Always be visual, because the Star Trek isn't always visual, but comics really have to be. So that was where we always started. This gave us a big, cool visual, which also makes for a big, cool action moment, which also makes for a really big, cool set piece for your game table. So again, that's just a great little Ouroboros moment.
Yeah, and having this to refer to the art just brings it alive. Jody, you worked on the story with Uhura and Bright Eyes, correct?
Yes.
In that story there. And what was your favorite thing when you encountered that story? What were you trying to extract from that? You mentioned it a little bit, but what was the social commentary then there between that relationship, and where do you want Bright Eyes to go as a character? Say if it's a game master, you had the opportunity to give them some guidance. What would you tell them about the character that maybe we wouldn't know?
I mean, I think like what Uhura was dealing with the story, just like setting up sort of a communication and understanding is like, that's the sort of thing that I think is really juicy to give players at a table, because I feel like a lot of players, especially in Star Trek, like even things that are maybe enemies, you just want to make friends with it. You just want to be friends with everything, or you kill everything. There's like kind of no middle ground in RPG. So I like to think that like, if you give them a character who would normally be an enemy, an NPC, but they're clearly young, they're clearly have been abandoned and they need help, I feel like most RPG players would just sort of jump in and try to find the clues of the mystery of how to communicate with them. So in a sense, like Uhura is very much like the prototypical, I just want to be friends with it RPG player character.
Yeah. And I think too, what's neat is, for budgetary limitations, there's only really humanoids in the original series and TNG generally. And it didn't really help us to expand our mind into when you do meet something that's way different, can you react to it in an empathetic manner? And I think you nailed that with the story with that. Do you want to talk toward that a little bit and how that's relevant to now?
Well, I think especially when there was the moment that Uhura and Bright Eyes could speak, and it's there in the RPG book, they, not it, was sort of like a core, to me, that was almost the core message of that interaction. Like, this is a being, and no matter how different they seem from all the humanoids that they are still a person. And that's sort of how you're going to find that ability to communicate and form understanding. So I think very much sort of like what we were saying before, it's sort of like taking the alien and finding the commonality and the common ground and where you can reach a concordance, really.
Yeah. Which is what we call it when the Tholian and elders all agree on something.
Mm-hmm.
That's a B. Joe Trimble reference, isn't it? I think one of her early works was the Concordance, the Star Trek Concordance.
It absolutely is. And you're the first person. No, straight up, Jim. No one has ever called us on that ever before.
What?
It was a super deep cut that we put in there. It's also a reference weirdly to another RPG thing I did called Vast that Jody and I did. We had a species that had a similar thing where they could come together in concordance. And so
Jim gets the Crystal Cube Award. I just made that.
I get the old time Star Trek fan award because I remember that far back.
That's awesome. We got to talk a little bit again about a couple other characters. I know we could talk about this all night, but there's other amazing characters that were created in here, like the Akosa. Who wants to talk to us about the Akosa?
Well, let me set the stage on the Akosa. The Akosa were created in collaboration with Jim McCann, who was one of our writers on Trek. You talked about diversity in Star Trek, and I don't want to put too much of an emphasis on this, but just so that it's really clear in terms of right out the gate what we were trying to do on Star Trek. The Star Trek room was Colin and myself, who obviously white guys, two pretty straight white guys. Then we had Jody, we had Brandon Easton, who's a black man, and we had Jim McCann, who's a gay man. The most diverse TOS room you'll ever see. And one that was IDW had it from the get-go, but we were very insistent on we need this room to reflect the readership. We need this room to reflect the world outside. We need this story to be able to talk about issues that are important to the Black community, that are important to the LGBTQ community, that are important to women, that are important to everybody who isn't James T. Kirk. We needed that framework. And it was really important that the room look like the Enterprise. And so that was a big part of what we tried to do as we were just starting it off. And the Icosa are a development of that. The Icosa on a very high level are a cool underwater species for your Aquaman flavored adventures. They are fun and cool and underwater. They can help you be fun and cool and underwater. They have a sort of inherent conflict with the other species on their planet who are actually just really them, but they've spent too much time above the water. So they've kind of calcified and become more rigid. And the way that it's an old school classic Star Trek story of two species that just are effectively the same species, but can't agree to get along and live in the way. But because it came from Jim and it was very specifically about stuff that Jim really cared about, it's a story about transgender issues. It's a story about how we deal with gender, how the Icosa are gender fluid and are capable of expressing gender in various ways and sort of see gender fundamentally very differently than humans do. And that the other species on their planet, the coral, that they have effectively become rigid in their gender ideas and rigid in their identities in general. And the more rigid they become, the more warlike they become, and the less rigid they become, the more at peace with nature they are. And that's sort of how the Icosa planet functions, which, now that I'm saying it out loud, is also just, again, the nostalgia theme of the book, accelerated very high or accelerated very low. So the Icosa come into the story for a very personal reason through Sulu and Ayal, which is a relationship and a romance that challenges Sulu's concepts of gender and what that means, because as sort of famously not straight as George Takei is, Sulu is traditionally at least TOS Sulu is traditionally very straight coded. And we thought this was a great opportunity to challenge that without breaking what George has sort of said is his headcanon of the character, which is that the character is straight. And so it's okay, if that's where his head is at, then let's challenge this straight character with somebody who doesn't really know how to fit inside that worldview. And Jim really brought that to the surface with the Icosa.
To the surface.
Well, let's go a little deeper on that with Fred. Fred, what was
I was just going to add to that, the gender. That was also a thing that we played with the Tholians, because why would a crystalline entity who isn't similar to us at all have a gender? So, Bright Eyes is they, them, and no one on the ship has a problem with that. So we just sort of want to establish that, this far into the future, there isn't an issue with different pronouns. It's just, okay, that's what it is. Cool.
Okay, good. And then Fred, your favorite part of, again, reverse engineering, your favorite character that you worked on?
Yeah, I know my connection might be a little spotty, so I'll keep it brief, and I apologize for that. But the Icosa were at the very top of my list of things from the book that I knew had to be in the Star Ventures product. So there are Icosa NPCs, and there's also Icosa player character rules as well. They were so imaginative and interesting and thought-provoking that was probably my favorite part of the entire project.
Okay. I felt that when I went through the book too. I think for a game master, people playing Star Trek Adventures, it's digging deep. There's the one point of just, reverse engineering and making playable characters, but it's also pushing social commentary in an appropriate and safe way with your players. And this book is as deep as you want to get into it. And I think it's nice that Jim you were talking about, your 7-year-old is looking at it and looked at it. And I like a book. I always say this is about Calvin and Hobbes, to bring in them. Every year I read it, I get something different out of it. And I have a feeling that this is this year 5 also. Jim, what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I reread it, when we were working on the outline with Fred, I was like, I knew the Icosa had to be in there. I knew the Tholians had to be in there, not just because they would be really cool player characters in somebody's game, but exactly because of those gender issues that we could drop into the game without hitting people over the head with it. Like, of course, TOS tended to hit people over the head with the social commentary because that was, what you did in the 60s to get people to get it. Right. But this was a way that we could just kind of slide it in. It's like, there it is, and just lay it out and just see what people did with it. So I just love the Icosa. When I opened up the comic book and they would first start, like, what really grabbed me about them was the vibrant color that you were able to bring into the comic book. It's like they were just like blowing right off the page because they were so different from even like the Enterprise crew with their colorful uniforms and the bridge and the Enterprise and stuff. It's like, here's the Icosa. They're underwater. You got the coral. You got their bodies are so vibrant and different and fluid. And it's like, oh man, this is so cool. I got to get that in the book. And if we couldn't have gotten access to the art, I don't know that we would have even done the project, because it's like, we got to have the art along with all the great content. And I am just so grateful that we were able to make that happen, because that really tied the whole product together so well, Fred, and Jackson and everybody. Yeah. The
Icosa are also really interesting on that level, just from a design and art perspective, because they're one of the few species that carry over between artists. Generally, the Icosa, or generally our issues take place in one sort of artist's oeuvre. But with the Icosa, they were one of those great opportunities where we could like link with a little story bit. So they show up in the 4th episode of the show, where the Enterprise is stranded on a Tholian web and learns how to, uses what it learned in the Tholian web to try to escape, but has to mount a rescue mission. That's the sort of new escalation, is they're stuck on it with another ship and they have to mount a rescue mission. And that's how they meet Ayal in the sort of spacefaring Icosa, and they end up using the water inside of the ship, which is their atmosphere, to escape. It gave us a really great opportunity to start thinking about these characters as water dwellers, right? But we really only saw Ayal. All of the others were gone. So we're only seeing Ayal. So Ayal is getting designed by Stephen Thompson, the artist on that issue. Then Sylvia Califano is coming in on the following issue and is coming in with or the following issues and is coming into Jim's script. Technically our script for the first one. Jim outlined the first episode of that and then wrote the other half, but it's all Jim's story. We just came in because Jim was having a day. But we come in with Ayal, and we've only seen Ayal. So that's all we've got for the Icosa when they start. And it's given to Sylvia, and it's like, hey, Sylvia, build a whole underwater world. And fortunately, Sylvia Califano is brilliant at exactly that kind of thing. When you talk about vibrancy and color and inviting and welcoming art, I mean, Sylvia's just got it in spades. She's a very incredible talent in that regard. And so she was able to build this out into this really beautiful and Undersea Kingdom that didn't feel immediately evocative of, Aquaman or Namor or any of that, which I thought was really also very important.
Absolutely.
I think the transformative thing for this, and I'm hoping we get more of it, is more collaborations between IDW and Modiphius, Jim. I mean, what are the chances, of that happening in the future? Do people have anything to look forward to with that?
I mean, it's always been on my mind, and I'm avidly reading everything that comes out, and it's just trying to figure out what could we do and where does it fit into the schedule, and what thematically, what does it link up to? And I've had a draft email in my inbox waiting to send at some point, but I just haven't had the time to figure out hey Jackson, hey Jody, what's next? What collaboration do we do next?
Yeah. Do you mind if I just plug something really fast then? And start. Let's start that collab right now. So Colin and I are back on Star Trek starting in October with the launch of Star Trek #1, brand new series, brand new build out. Remember back when I told you about that failed line that we couldn't get off the ground because Picard happened? Well, we're doing it. We're doing it as a single book right now. It's called Star Trek, no colon, no title, just Star Trek. We've been calling it flagship internally just to keep it.
No stinking A, no stinking B, no.
Yep, exactly. And the point of Star Trek is to tell stories that exist in effectively a 2-year period between the end of Voyager and the beginning of Nemesis. So it's during the height of Next Generation period. All of the characters from Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and TNG who made it through the series are alive, and we're using all of them. We're treating it like the Avengers. So the book is going to be a ship called the Theseus. USS Theseus, it's a Discovery class vessel, so it's effectively an experimental technology vessel that's lived in dry dock its whole life. If you want to know the origin of the USS Theseus, it's in Star Trek Year 5, number 13, when it's the flagship that replaces the Enterprise. It might even be in...
fully statted out in the tie-in.
Yep.
It's fully statted out in the tie-in. So there you go. So that same ship, 110 years later, has been completely rekitted and refitted by its engineer.
Same ship.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the whole point. That's why we named it. So the Theseus is coming out of dry dock and is going out on a mission with Benjamin Sisko in the captain's chair. He's coming out of the wormhole with a mission from the prophets. He's got a really unique and strange relationship with time, but an even stranger relationship with his son. And they are going to be going out on this adventure to try to figure out what the prophets want of him now to help save the galaxy. He's got Data at first officer. He's got Tom Paris at the helm. He's got, as I said, a mystery in the engine room. He has a mystery in the engine room, and he's got and we've got a couple of new characters. One who's a legacy to Enterprise, Lily Sato, who is the 7th generation of the Sato communications line. And now she's part Andorian because the family is intermarried with Andorians. And a new character named Talir, who's a non-binary Vulcan with a whole mysterious past that we're going to be getting into over time. So the book is
and Beverly.
Oh yes, and Beverly Crusher is our third officer, who I for some reason didn't say, even though she's straight up one of our most important characters. The whole idea behind this book is to drive forward new Star Trek ideas that take place in the oeuvre of Next Generation. So in the same way that we were able to support your TOS time period with Year 5, I hope we can support your TNG time period with Star Trek. Let's talk offline, but even just knowing how much you guys are doing with and have done to support Klingon games, Klingons are going to be very important to what we're doing. And I think there is almost certainly some great overlap between what you're doing and what we are. So let's talk.
And refresh my memory. I didn't catch it. Is this a standalone or is it a mini series or?
No, this is an ongoing series, and I've been very coy about this, but it's becoming less and less coy. It's not just a series; it's going to ideally be a whole line of books. We're just starting right now, and I can't say. Yeah, I can't say everything yet about what it is we're doing, but suffice to say, we fell in love with doing this on Year 5, and really are trying to. So we're trying to not just to do that. That's going to be just Colin and I. There's no room, just because of the way that it works. A room wouldn't really function. It's very intertwined and very specific, but we are really trying to find a space to bring the room concept back, because I thought it was just so valuable. And frankly, I just want to write more books with Jody. So hopefully we'll have that up and running pretty soon too.
Sweet. Well, we'll definitely be in touch, no doubt.
Yeah,
that feels like it fits right in the wheelhouse of what we're looking at. So
you heard it here first, folks.
Well, I'm. Well, the bad thing about it, though, I want to say you heard it here first, but this will probably air in a month or 3. No, this will air in 3 weeks. Will it still be the first place they heard it?
Probably.
That's great.
Yeah, the first issue doesn't come out until October. So
honestly, I think October 26th is when the first issue comes out. So if you're listening to this anytime around October 26th, that's when you got it.
Awesome. I can almost see it, Fred. It was a little blurry, but
right.
Oh, was that the book?
Yeah, this is Star Trek.
This one here, right?
Yeah.
I have
there's a preview.
622.
Yeah, there's a preview of what we're doing there, and also the death of Gary 7. No big deal, or not Gary 7. Not Gary 7. Sorry,
Gary Mitchell.
Gary Mitchell. The other Gary.
Yeah, it's too many Garys. That's the actual subtitle of Star Trek is Too Many Garys.
Star Trek Too Many Garys #1 coming in October.
For the first time, I think I've been left speechless because I have too many questions. You've seated me with all these questions.
I mean, we saw you fall out. We saw you pretty much fall out of your seat there. So
well, Jim knows which character I want to ask about, but I'm not.
Yeah. I think
who do you want to ask about?
I am a veritable expert.
Oh, is it this way? Seven.
I have so many theories about what she did coming back, so I'm hoping this book answers it.
Well, I'm willing to bet Picard got in the way of that a little bit.
Well, that's
I guess.
Let's. We have Picard's not getting in the way of anything with us, which is awesome. Oh. We have full cooperation with the shows. We have full cooperation with Star Trek. Fortunately, we go way back with a lot of the people who are working on the shows. Colin and I are friends with Henry Alonzo Myers on Strange New Worlds. Like we're deep in this, so we're trying to operate across the board and not be afraid of licensing issues like that on this book. We'll see how far that gets us, but so far it's been nothing but supportive. That said, you're not going to see 7 of 9 for a while. I'll tell you that straight up. And that is because our mandate here is to showcase characters who have not been showcased recently. And so we started this with the very, very much with the understanding of that we're trying to unearth characters who have not gotten their spotlight recently. And I'm so happy for Jerry Ryan that she has had that spotlight with 7. Yeah. We're going to let Picard have that space. I think that is only right.
That's so exciting because like Jackson, I know that era, right? I know that era earlier, and there's so many characters in all the movies and all the series that were just not given their opportunity to do a lot. I mean, certainly some of the novels have. I mean, actually, the recent last 20 some years, all the different novelists that are doing Star Trek novels, they do a great job of pulling in all these characters that you just don't get to see much on screen, but they give them these full blown, opportunities. And it's like, oh, it's so cool. Like just as a game master and as a player, it's like, oh, I'm sparking all kinds of ideas here. Stories, you can pull in this character, you can pull in that character. And whatever happened to Riker, Thomas Riker, is he dead or is he still out there? Did Ro go rescue?
Whatever did happen to Thomas Riker? I wonder. Yeah,
there's so much that you can do with this. So I am so excited now.
And now that we can set out children, we can do the staff for Muriel, B'Elanna and Tom's daughter. She's 3 years old at that time, 3 or 4 at that time. So I'll just stat that out.
Bring in the salamander kids.
Oh my God.
No.
All right.
No.
You took it too far.
I'm out.
We've reached the threshold of this episode. So let's do this because there's so much to talk about. We're way over time, which is good. I really appreciate everyone who's been here. So I'm going to go around one time to maybe hear one last take on working on this project, maybe an Easter egg or something. Let's start with Fred. Fred, give us some final feedback on your thoughts with
that. I mean, literally it was a dream come true. And I was so grateful to actually, get some of those scripts, some of the books in the series hadn't even been printed yet. And I literally just had scripts to work with for I think the last couple. And it was literally take Star Trek comic books and turn into RPG content. It was a dream come true. It felt like something I was born to do, and just so grateful to have a chance to do it. And especially on such a great story that felt so Star Trek and had such great art. It was a real honor to be able to contribute.
Jimmy,
and check out Star Trek number 400 from IDW on stands now if you want to get a little preview of that of the new Star Trek series.
Hey, thanks for that.
You bet.
Plug you all day long. Absolutely.
Jody, what about you? Any other thoughts about it?
In terms of Easter eggs, I know I mentioned I named the Andorian presidential candidate after my grandmother, but in my first story, there's 2 scientists who are named after my other grandparents because, they are the ones who introduced my dad to Star Trek, and he's a big reason I'm a Star Trek fan. So my dad got to see characters named after his parents in Star Trek and space doing science stuff. So
isn't that great? You take them into the future. They live forever. They're immortalized. You're so awesome for that. Jackson, any final tips?
I want to leave you guys with the backbone of the book and the thing that I put. As I said, we had 4 principles on Star Trek Year 5. Number 4 was be visual. Number 3 was optimism, not inertia, which was basically like ignore the Roddenberry box because he ignored it in TOS. In For 2, it was when in doubt, Kirk. Always put Shatner forward, always put Kirk forward because this is his show. But number 1 was character first. And I think this is something that I really want to just stress to anybody who's listening to this, who's a game master especially, but also players, because I think this gets down to what always starts the coolest and best and most interesting stories. And I've had some of the greatest stories in my life in RPGs. And there is a phrase that we used. I wrote it on the fucking board, right? This is like the North Star for us on Star Trek Year 5 and really on Star Trek in general. Which is from Dorothy Fontana, the for my money best writer of Star Trek TOS. It's her and Gene Kuhn were just the soul of that show. And Dorothy Fontana says, even though Harlan Ellison wrote my favorite episode, Dorothy Fontana says, stories about objects don't work. Stories about relationships do. So whenever you find yourself really just kicking that MacGuffin down the line and trying to make sure that your characters just go to that next dungeon to get that next MacGuffin, try to find a way and try to look at it through the eyes of what would get you to go down into a dungeon. And that's the relationships you have with the people around you. That's the relationships you have with your parents. It's the relationships you have with your love. It's much more like character oriented stuff. So we've talked a lot about meaning and greater stuff and mechanics, but at the end of the day, what games are and what comics are stories about relationships. And for Dorothy Fontana to be the person who told us that felt appropriate on a Star Trek podcast.
And just to add credence to that, the reason Jackson and I are friends are we met in an RPG, our characters became friends, and we became friends after that. And that game is still going.
It's true.
10 years.
Oh,
after
I
10
love
years.
stories. Now I'm going to be the one crying. And I said I wanted to make you cry, Jackson.
I got my shit together.
The bow I'll put on it before, as traditionally I hand it over to Jim to close up, is it thrills me that this is a phenomenal first time for Star Trek Adventures, pairing with Star Trek Year 5. We now hope and have an inkling that it's not going to be the last time. But for someone like myself who collected comics my whole life, and I used to play Marvel Superheroes RPG trying to recreate that, Star Trek is so there now. We're there now, but even more so, as is written in the story, baked in, caked in, is it's really opening it up to everybody to play the game fairly. And I really want to say, thank you, Jackson. Thank you, Jody, for doing not just pumping out a comic book with words, but actually following that Star Trek tradition of making sure that there's a commentary that you can bake on, chew on, and talk about after reading the comic. Now I have to go back and read it all over again, thanks to you, which I will now with the new enthusiasm, and make sure that others read it also. And then again, Fred, for you, I love that you adapted it, because the minute I read the transition for Star Trek Adventures, I was like, oh, he nailed it. And it was just so beautiful the way it was laid out. So this made me more excited. I hope everyone listening into this, if you didn't pick it up, either the comic book or the module, we don't sales pitch on this one, but it sounds to me like one of the strongest backstories that I've seen so far. Jim, you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, it's Star Trek through and through. Like I got the graphic novels and the issues right there on the shelf, along with all the gold keys from back in the day, all the other stuff that's come out. I mean, there's been so many comic books over 50 something years of Star Trek, and it's all great stuff. And to be able to have had the opportunity to do this project, it was a blessing. And Fred, you were saying it was your dream job. This project was like it just fell together so nicely, because like we got the books, I read the scripts that you sent, that I hadn't finished the story. And I was a little conflicted because I don't want to read the scripts. I want to read the finished product. I want to be surprised, right? But by the nature of the work, had to spoil myself and read them. But the outline came together really easily as I remember it. It was like, we knew exactly what we wanted to put in the book, and then Fred ran off with it, and we had great support from Jackson and Jody and your whole team. Super supportive. I just can't thank you enough for all that you did, especially the artwork. I mean, just the reality, artwork ain't cheap. And to have been able to get as much as you were willing to give us, it was like, oh my gosh, this is such a blessing that you were able to do that, and it made the product so perfect with everything all together. And we did the trade off with the advertisements and stuff, which was great. It expanded the line in a new way. It gave us reach into a part of the fan base that we hadn't really touched before, like the hardcore comic book fans of Star Trek. We hadn't really touched yet. And it was like, oh, this is so cool. Now we need to, build on that. And it's just, trying to figure out what does that look like. And, obviously we have some ideas here, which is great. Yeah, if I had to tell the fans anything, like don't sleep on this series because it's Star Trek to the core, like hardcore. It is all Star Trek all day long, especially you original series fans. Like there is so much great stuff in here. You got the Tholians, you got the Iosians, you got new species, you got Kirk, Spock, everybody. Like if you need that bridge from the end of the 3 seasons to where they end up in the motion picture, like this is it. Like you got McCoy with the beard, and you got Spock going off to do his Kolinar thing. And it's like it just bridges so nicely from that because we may not get that now. I mean,
I was so happy to see that beard. Oh,
yeah, it was so great. The disco beard with the medallion and everything.
Just the best. Just the best.
Anyway, so I just can't thank you both enough, and your entire team.
Thank you.
Please extend the thanks to your teams too, the artists,
absolutely,
the writers, everybody, because. Like this was one of the handful of products that I've worked on over the last 6 years for the game line that kind of felt charmed. Like it all just fell together. Yeah. It was like, oh, this was easy. This was easy to put together. It was like, it made it easy for me. So thanks to Fred, thanks to Jackson, Jody. I mean, it was just so well done. And I know we've gone way over here. I did have one question for both of you, if you're willing to answer it. It's not really Easter eggs, but just kind of I know as a writer and an editor and a developer for all these game lines, like stuff has to end up on the floor sometimes. You just by nature of the beast, you can't fit every idea that you have that you want to pack into it. So just thinking about year 5 as a total package, like what's the one thing that you wish you had been able to add into it that you just couldn't find a place to fit it?
It's wild because honest to God, man, year 5, we didn't really have a lot that we left on the table. We really did everything we wanted to do. If I go back to that outline and I'm like, do we leave anything on the table? And like, genuinely, I don't think we did. I mean, from a large perspective, we didn't. In fact, we weren't even supposed to have an epilogue issue. Issue 25 was a mistake made by someone at IDW who was like, I got an extra issue approved. Do you want to do it? Like, we threw that thing together in a very weird way because everybody got to write a little bit of it. Like we got a surprise Valentine's Day special from Paul Cornell. Like we just didn't really have in that way that you talk about. But that said, what do I wish we'd been able to get in that we didn't? Jody, do you even remember any of your other pitches? Like I'm trying to. I didn't have any. The two stories I did were the 2 you did.
Yeah. I remember being on a call with Jackson and Colin, and they were like, "Oh, we need to get the story going." And I was like, "Harry Mudd runs for president," and they laughed. And I'm like, "No, I'm serious."
Yeah.
I do have one thing. Well, sort of. I mean, because just again, because of the Leonard Nimoy family connection, I really wanted the chance to write more Spock. But then I finally got to do it in the final issue. I got to do those pages of him resigning from Starfleet and heading back to Vulcan, and just the memories he was carrying with him, and just the slightest emotional reaction to them before he had that all stripped away. So, I mean, what I would have regretted not being able to write, I did get to write in the end because we got that extra bonus issue.
Wow. That's awesome.
Yeah,
that's a gold star then. Yeah.
It's wild because normally I have something where it's like, oh, we have this cool bit, but we cut it. But honestly, I don't think we did. I think Star Trek Year 5 also felt charmed.
That's okay. Truthfully, that makes me feel so complete and puts closure as I'm turning each page. It's the cherry on top. So I love it.
Yeah, it's just I will say there's a thing that got rejected, but we turned it into the Icosa. So I don't really think of it as a loss.
Got it.
But the original version of the Icosa story before when Colin and I were first pitching it, like before we ever brought it to the table, because how that happened was we said we want to do an issue where the Enterprise encounters a world at war, and by intervening, by trying to do the right thing, ends up causing worse stuff to happen. We wanted to do a story about military adventurism and how sometimes even when you want to help, that doesn't mean that you should. Mm-hmm. And that it's very, very hard to draw that line. And the way that we want to do that story is a story that I've pitched a bunch of times with a different captain than Kirk, which is I've always pitched it as a Captain Archer story. But I was like, screw it. If this is the one time we're going to get to do it in Star Trek, I'll do it as a Captain Kirk story. But the idea when it was Captain Archer or when it was Captain Kirk is it's first contact with the Cardassians. And it's the first time that we ever meet the Cardassian Union, because first contact with Cardassians is not properly essayed anywhere. We never see it. So I was like, all right, this is the first time we ever see the Cardassians. And when they show up, the Cardassians are a like wonderful, artistic, religious plurocracy. They're this like wildly peaceful. They're not at all the Cardassians that we know from Deep Space Nine. They're they could not be more different as a culture, which is something that Deep Space Nine talks about. Like, oh, like back in the day, we were this like artistic, religious, pluralist culture. And we wanted to say like, yeah, back in the day was like 100 years ago. And the Cardassians, and because the Enterprise gets involved, they end up screwing up. They don't understand how internal Cardassian politics work. And they accidentally kind of kick the snowball down the hill to start the rise of fascism. And that like within a week, by the time the Enterprise leaves Cardassia, it's the Cardassian Union. And all of the old art is being burned and all the books are being burned and everything's being destroyed because the Cardassians don't want to remember this period of their history. And the last bit, when it was an Archer story, especially the last bit was going to be they're like flying away and Spock sort of mentions, oh, I am getting life signs from a world that is known to have ancient spacefaring. If you want to go somewhere and just like touch base with somebody who isn't as volatile, like, the planet of Bajor is right there, and have Archer be like, I think we've done enough damage. But the audience knows, yeah, the damage they've done is to Bajor, and it won't happen for a while. But when it does, it's going to be, caustic. And we've pitched this like first contact with the Cardassian story so many times that I know it's never going to happen. But also I know that like we turned it into the Icosa. We gave that to Jim, and Jim said, well, I want to talk about gender. And it was like, great, because the Cardassians are fucking not here. So let's make it something completely different. And that's where,
hey, Jackson,
that's where those issues.
You could always pitch that story for a Star Trek Adventures module. You could
let's talk.
All right. With that said, again, that's why we call this continuing conversations, because we never run out of stuff to talk about. So hopefully, Jody,
clearly,
Jackson, Fred, that at some point we'll be able to have you back on to discuss new projects. I really appreciate the insight you give into the story. I know as a comic book reader and a reader of anything, that once you talk to the writer, you get to a whole new depth. Whenever you speak to the writing group. So I really appreciate you taking the time do this with us. I'm going to shout out for a second time in a week. Usually I mix up the brick and mortars, but because I picked up my Star Trek 400 comic from Joe Field, Flying Colors Comics in Concord, California. That's who I'm shouting out today, because again, they're brick and mortar, and where would we be without that tactile experience of walking into a store? All right, so let's do a quick go round of thank yous. We'll go Fred, Jackson, Jody, Jim, and we'll end the show. Fred?
Yeah, I got my Star Trek 400 and issue number 1 of Lower Decks at Mayhem Comics and Games right here in Ames, Iowa. Thanks for having me on tonight, Michael. It's always a pleasure talking to you. It's great meeting Jackson and Jody. And Jim, I'm sure I'll be in touch with you soon. Thanks, everybody.
All right, Jackson, your shout out.
I have several stores that I love here in Los Angeles, California, as we have a wealth of riches here. But shout out to Collector's Paradise, who did a lot of huge support on Star Trek Year 5. They have a bunch of locations all around Southern California. I love them very much, and definitely owe them a lot for moving this book. So Collector's Paradise out here in LA, big shout out.
Sweet. Jody.
And Collector's Paradise is where I got my Lower Decks number 1 most recently. But since Jackson already shouted them out, I will shout out House of Secrets in Burbank, which was one of the first comic shops to support the work I was doing. I used to like crash on their sofa and write after I picked up my comics on Wednesday sometimes. So not only can you find my comics there, some of them were written in there. So
yay.
Oh, that's awesome. All right, Jim, take us out.
So I don't actually have a local comic book store that I know. So I need to find one. Clearly, you would think in the DC metro area there'd be some good ones. I guess. You've got some great ones. You've got I lived in the DC metro area, man. I can turn you on. I think it's Big Comet. Big Comet was amazing back when I was there. I think is what they were called.
Is Third Eye in the DC area too? I think
it is
nearby. Yeah.
Third Eye.
Clearly, I need to do some digging here. Yeah, some great stuff. But what I want to do is I'll just blanket thank all the comic book stores out there for being a key piece of the industry and keeping the love alive and hand selling comics when you can. I know hand selling is a lost art, but I haven't forgotten it because I was doing it back in the day. Hand selling, you get it in people's hands, you get them into it. So grab those Star Trek issues off the shelves, put them in your friends' hands, put them in your strangers' hands. Just tell them to read them because they're great, and we love them, and we want more. Always want more story. We always need more story.
We're coming for you.
Yeah. Good job. Yeah. All right. So next time, IDIC.
Live long and prosper. Be safe, be well. Thank you all so much for being on the show. Can't thank you enough. We'll definitely be in touch.